Hi guys, and welcome to video number 8 of our Unit 3 lecture video series about America's Revolution and the Early Republic from 1754 to 1800. We are going to be talking about the Constitution today. So the last video we talked a little bit about the Constitutional Convention, some of the compromises that were made in the Constitution and the debates over ratification. Today we're going to be talking about the government that was created under the Constitution itself and how that government changed or did not change thanks to the Constitution. So let's get into it. All right. So first of all, what were the major characteristics of the government under the Constitution? And I am going to give you a more extensive answer to this, but I'm going to start by giving you the sort of one sentence answer that comes from the curriculum framework. According to the curriculum framework, delegates from the states participated in the Constitutional Convention that created this sort of government: a limited but dynamic central government embodying federalism and providing for a separation of power between its three branches. So, limited central government, it was definitely limited in what it can do, but it was dynamic. It could shift. It was flexible to a certain extent, which we'll talk about. It embodied the characteristic of federalism, and it did have a separation of powers between three branches. So, let's take a look at each of these. Okay. So, federalism, a federal system. I know a federal system sounds like we're saying federal as in national, because we often use the term federal instead of national when we're talking about the government. But a federal system is not a system in which the national government has all the power. It's actually a federal system is one in which power is shared between state and national governments. And you may actually recall this from human geography. It doesn't imply that one is more important than the other, just that this is a system in which there are multiple levels of government that share power. In the case of the United States, there are a number of different levels. We have the federal or national government, we have state level governments, we have county level governments, we have city level municipal authorities. So we do have a lot of layers of governance and jurisdiction in our country. So we are definitely a federal system. So this is different from a confederal system, in which the states or the more local governments units have the majority of the power. This is what we had under the Articles of Confederation. You recall I said in the last couple of videos, it made for a pretty weak central government that was unable to respond to crisis. Also different from a unitary system. A unitary system is one in which the national government holds most or all of the power, and local governments have little to no power at all. Okay, so we have this federal government system in which there's shared power between the state and the national government. Okay, so where is federalism evident in the Constitution? So Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. Article 6 says in the Constitution that the national government trumps the state governments if their laws contradict each other, essentially saying that the national government is the supreme form of government, and if state laws contradict national laws, then it is the national government that trumps those state laws. So this is something that is, again, very different from the Articles of Confederation, because this is not something you would have seen in the Articles of Confederation. More importantly, this is only true for enumerated powers, which we'll talk about in a second. Powers that are actually specifically stated in the Constitution. All right, the federal government actually doesn't have a ton of powers that are stated in the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8 talks about basically numbers all the powers that the federal government has, like the power to declare war. The 10th Amendment states that the powers that are not delegated to the United States, as in the federal government, are reserved to the states. So essentially, any power that's not explicitly enumerated and stated in the Constitution belongs to the states. Okay, these are known as reserved powers. So essentially, anything you can think of that is not in the Constitution is reserved to the states to decide on. This means the powers that belong to the national government are very finite and limited. They are specifically stated and listed out. Here's what the national government actually has the power to do. Whereas the powers that belong to state governments are infinite and broad, because there are so many things that the founding fathers could not possibly have anticipated. And there was a reason why they created a government this way that had flexibility. Okay, they wanted obviously to keep much of the power into the hands of the state governments, because they didn't want a super strong federal government like a British monarchy. But also they understood that things would change. They wanted a lasting government. They didn't want a constitution that needed to be rewritten every generation for new things that occurred, new trends, new developments, new processes, new inventions. I mean, the founding fathers could not possibly have anticipated cars and cell phones and the internet. All right. And how do we regulate these? Well, a lot of this is decided by the states, although some is decided by the federal government. Okay. So let's talk about enumerated and reserved powers a little bit more. Okay, so like I said, there are certainly enumerated powers that you can see here on the left-hand side. Enumerated, again, are the powers that are numbered, so to speak, in the Constitution, listed out. These are ones that belong to only the federal government. This is Article 1, Section 8. According to this article, the national government is the only one who can coin money. Remember, this was an issue under the Articles of Confederation. We had all these different states printing their own currencies, and maybe one state didn't take the currency of the other state, which was an issue. So according to the Constitution, only the federal government can print money, coin money. They're the only ones who can manage foreign affairs. I don't care how much Colorado wants to make a treaty with France. They're not allowed to under the Constitution. Only the federal government has the power to manage foreign affairs. They can create a mail service, a postal service. Only the federal government has the right to declare war. Again, states, which is probably a good thing, are not allowed to declare war on each other or other places. And the federal government has the right to regulate both international and interstate commerce. And this is, by the way, very important. This idea of interstate commerce. Interstate commerce means any kind of business that's happening across state lines. This is a really, really important clause because this particular power that is enumerated for the federal government has been used and interpreted very broadly and flexibly to allow the government to regulate many things that we would not necessarily think of as a power belonging to the federal government. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea that they could regulate any business that went across state lines. And again, this was important because, like I said, under the Articles of Confederation, the states could essentially tax another state to import goods from one place to another as though they were separate countries. And the Interstate Commerce Clause put a stop to this. Okay, so state governments, on the other hand. So among other things, there are so many powers of the state's governments, but here's a few that they can do. They can regulate public safety, as in make laws for crimes and create a police force. They're able to create schools and regulate what's taught in those schools. They can regulate intrastate commerce, as in commerce that happens within the boundaries of a state, their state, obviously. And literally anything that is not specifically given to the national government in Article 1, Section 8. And one final thing that's really important to note, both the national and the state governments have the power to tax. They have a shared power to tax. So your income can be taxed both by the federal government and the state government. And in a lot of places, it is taxed by both the federal and state government. So they both have the power to tax people. Okay, and I will say, you will recall under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had no power to tax and no power to raise any money to create an army. So obviously that's something that changed with the Constitution. Okay, so let's talk about separation of powers. Okay, so we have three different branches of the government, which I hope you're familiar with. Probably. The legislative branch is the one that makes the laws, as in they legislate, they make laws. The executive branch is responsible for carrying out and enforcing the laws. And the judicial branch is in charge of interpreting the laws and making sure they align with the Constitution and declaring whether or not a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. So the legislative branch at the national level is composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive branch is, of course, the president and all of his cabinet secretaries. And the judicial branch would be the federal court system, the highest court of which is the Supreme Court, but there are many, many federal courts. And of course, important to this is the idea of checks and balances. Each branch of power, the reason there are three branches, and I'll remind you, this is an Enlightenment idea that was outlined by Montesquieu. Each different branch of the government is intended to make sure the other branch doesn't become too powerful. So they each have a way to check the power of another branch. For example, the president has veto power on laws made by Congress. If laws are created by Congress and the president doesn't like it, they can veto that law and say, no, this is not going to become a law. Now, that said, the president's always only one man. So the Congress can override the presidential veto with a 2/3 vote, which is a significant majority. And that's actually pretty hard to do. Okay. But if 2/3 of the Congress thinks, no, you're crazy, president, we're not vetoing this law, then they can actually override the presidential veto and the law will go onto the books. So a lot of care was taken to distribute power to govern in order to protect people from tyranny. So a lot of care was taken to separate out these different responsibilities to avoid having one person or one small group of people making all the decisions. Here's a little color-coded for your convenience list. The color of the item on the bulleted list matches the branch that's being checked by that ability. So you'll notice legislature is green, executive branch is orange, and judicial is blue. So you can see here the legislative branch has the power to do all of these things. Their checks on the executive branch are that the legislative branch can impeach the president. They can approve of treaties or deny treaties that are proposed by the president, and they can override presidential vetoes, as I already mentioned. They can also impeach judges. This is a check on judicial power, or they can amend the Constitution if the judicial branch says, no, that's not constitutional. You can't make this law. The legislature has the power to amend the Constitution to create a new law, saying, well, now it's in the Constitution. That is very difficult to do, though. The executive branch, they can check the power of the judicial branch by appointing judges. They can choose who is appointed as a judge for federal courts. And they can check the power of the legislature by vetoing laws. And the judicial branch can overturn laws to check the power of the legislature branch, saying, hey, this is not constitutional. They can also overturn executive orders for the same reason. So this is our kind of system of checks and balances. Okay, so overall, what kind of changes and continuities in the government do we see after the ratification of the Constitution? So there's quite a few changes. Here's some big ones. So moving from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the federal government now has the power, is superior to the state power. This is from the Supremacy Clause. Like I said, they declared, hey, the federal government, when it clashes with state governments over an enumerated power, the federal government's laws go. I mean, that's the supreme law. The federal government receives the power to tax. That's added. States already had that power, but now the federal government does too. They added a new federal court system, which didn't exist before. They added a president. There was literally no executive branch. There was no chief executive under the Articles of Confederation. So that's added. That's a big one. The representation in federal legislature changes. Under the Articles, it was a unicameral, so a single house and equal representation for every single state. Under the Constitution, as I said in the last video, 2 houses. The House of Representatives is decided by the population of the state, how big they are. They get more representatives, and the Senate has equal representation. It is slightly easier to amend the Constitution than under the Articles. And under the Articles of Confederation, you needed every single state to agree to any change, which means things didn't change, essentially. So really hard to make any changes to the Articles of Confederation. Now, it's not easy with the Constitution, okay? When an amendment is sent out to the states for ratification, you still need 75% of the states, that's 38 out of 50 states, to agree to the amendment to the Constitution. And just to demonstrate how hard this is, there are 27 amendments to the Constitution, 10 of which, I'll remind you, were the Bill of Rights and passed immediately, essentially, after the ratification. Okay, the other 17 have been passed sometime between 1791 and the present day. But that's not a lot of changes, especially considering there have been over 12,000 amendments proposed. Pretty much around 200 every couple of years. So yeah, as I said, very difficult still to amend the Constitution, even though it's slightly easier than it was under the Articles of Confederation. The federal regulation of trade changes a little bit. Trade between states and international trade is allowed to be regulated by the federal government. And the federal government has responsibility for foreign affairs, okay, and the states do not have that responsibility. So the kind of TLDR of this is the national government makes a lot of gains. They have many new powers that make the national government much more useful, whereas it wasn't functional at all under the Articles, but it does not control everything, and many, many, many of the powers to govern are left to the states. Some continuities. What did not change with the Constitution? Well, the type of government remained unchanged. It's still a republic. It's not a monarchy. So that's one thing, is there remained this basic republic representative form of government. And another thing, not so great, is that many individuals were still denied rights and freedoms. African Americans, both enslaved and free, were denied rights and freedoms and rights to vote. In many places, rights to own property. In southern states, they were even more restricted. Native Americans were not citizens and did not have rights and freedoms. And women, of course, were also denied many rights and freedoms, including enfranchisement and the right to vote. So these are continuities in the government. Consider that in the government, even though the word slave is never used, slavery is definitely enshrined in our Constitution and allowed to continue. The Constitution was set up in such a way, because of the Southern delegates, that slavery is essentially guaranteed under the Constitution. There's a few different places it's dealt with. The 3/5 Compromise, Article 1, Section 2, I discussed in the last video, and also the fact that the slave trade was protected until 1808. Article 1, Section 9, also discussed in the last video. And then finally, the Fugitive Clause. The Fugitive Clause existed in Article 4, Section 2, and it said essentially that if you have someone who is a laborer or has some term of service, read slave is what they meant. If you have an enslaved person and they run away or leave, they're not discharged from their labor, as in they need to be returned to their owner. So the Fugitive Clause basically said that the states were responsible for returning people who ran away from slavery. So even though the term slavery was never used, slavery was definitely embedded in the Constitution itself. In terms of individual rights, the language is very broad. It didn't specifically exclude or include. The word woman is never used, the word, so it's very, very broad. Now, on the downside, that means it didn't guarantee a lot of people rights, but on the upside, it was flexible enough that it grants us sort of the language and the ability to move forward over the last couple hundred years and progress. And we see the development of civil rights movements and these trends towards better enfranchisement for all people. So it does allow that flexibility because it didn't specifically exclude. So on the upside, we didn't have to throw away the Constitution or entirely amend the Constitution in order to grant women and people of color the right to vote, for example. Okay, so that's it. That's all we have for this video for the Constitution. In the next video, we're going to be getting into some of the challenges of the new republic. It is a doozy. It's actually a two-part video. We're going to have two videos for that. There is quite a bit packed into the next topic, so we'll see you then.